How did a handful of improvised flying machines evolve into the most decisive weapon on Europe's largest battlefield since World War II? That question now sits at the center of the Ukraine war, because what began as a tactical curiosity has quietly become the backbone of Kyiv's entire military strategy. And if drones now decide who advances and who bleeds, what does that mean for Russia's future on the front lines? In the early phase of the war, Ukrainian drones were treated as useful but limited tools. Small, fragile, and often civilian-modified, they were used to scout positions, spot artillery fire, or harass exposed Russian armor. Moscow initially dismissed them as nuisances, cheap gadgets, no match for Russia's massed artillery manpower and industrial depth. Yet war does not reward assumptions. It rewards adaptation. And Ukraine adapted faster. By late 2023 and throughout 2024, drones had shifted from support assets to precision weapons. FPV drones, often costing a fraction of a single artillery shell, began destroying tanks' air defense systems and fortified positions. Ukrainian units learned to fly low-evade, jamming, and strike from angles Russian doctrine never fully prepared for. What mattered most was not just the technology, but how quickly Ukraine integrated it into every layer of battlefield decision-making. President Volodymyr Zelensky would later describe this transformation as structural rather than incremental. Infantry still held ground, artillery still shaped the battlefield, but drones became the connective tissue between them. They verified targets, corrected fire, tracked movements, and increasingly delivered the kill themselves. In modern war, seeing first often means striking first, and Ukraine ensured it saw almost everything. Western analysts began to take notice. Reports from Reuters and Defense News throughout 2024 highlighted how Ukrainian drone units were no longer operating on the margins, but embedded directly into brigades operating in real time alongside maneuver units. Unlike traditional reconnaissance drones, shortened the kill chain to minutes, sometimes seconds. Russian forces, by contrast, often required layered approvals and centralized coordination, slowing reaction times in an environment where delay was lethal. This shift carried strategic consequences far beyond the trenches. NATO planners quietly studied Ukraine's model, recognizing that the war was revealing a future where mass armor formations and static defenses could be neutralized by swarms of expendable systems, guided by real-time intelligence. Under a U.S. administration led by President Donald Trump, Western military thinking increasingly emphasized cost-exchange ratios, how cheaply one side could destroy far more expensive assets of the other. Ukraine's drones embodied that logic. But the real breakthrough came when drones stopped being treated as individual tools and became an ecosystem. Ukraine did not merely deploy drones, it built processes around them. Training pipelines accelerated, feedback loops tightened. Operators reviewed footage, shared tactics, and refined approaches at a pace that mirrored software development more than traditional military doctrine. Each engagement generated data, and each dataset fed the next improvement. For Russian troops on the ground, the psychological impact was immediate. Soldiers learned that exposure for more than seconds could be fatal. Vehicles hesitated to move. Artillery relocated constantly, often firing fewer rounds from greater distances to avoid detection. Even rear areas lost their sense of safety. The battlefield was no longer a line, it was a volume of airspace saturated with invisible threats. And yet, this was only the beginning. What started as adaptation soon became dominance, and dominance would be measured not in anecdotes, but in numbers that stunned even seasoned analysts. Those numbers and the logic behind them would redefine how this war is understood. Meanwhile, the first concrete statistics emerging from Kyiv would soon force the world to confront just how total Ukraine's drone transformation had become. What does it actually mean when one number reshapes an entire war? when Ukrainian officials revealed that drones were responsible for roughly 80% of Russian targets destroyed. The figure sounded almost abstract. Yet behind that percentage lies a scale of destruction that explains why Russia's advances have slowed to a crawl, and why analysts now describe Ukraine's drone campaign as the most intensive unmanned warfare effort in modern history. If drones now account for the majority of battlefield losses, can any traditional force structure survive this pace? According to statements released by Kyiv in early 2025, Ukrainian drones struck nearly 820,000 verified Russian targets over the course of the previous year. That number alone is staggering, but when placed in context, it becomes even more disruptive. If those strikes represent 80% of total confirmed hits, Ukraine likely neutralized over 1 million Russian targets in a single year. Spread across months, that translates into tens of thousands of impacts every 30 days, day after day, hour after hour. This is not symbolic warfare. It is industrialized attrition. Analysts at Defense News have pointed out that the average daily rate of drone strikes now exceeds what many Cold War armies expected from artillery barrages during peak offensives. Ukraine has effectively replaced massed guns with distributed air power delivered from machines that fit into backpacks and cost less than a single tank tread. The strategic implications are profound. Russian units are no longer facing occasional precision strikes. They are operating under constant surveillance and threat. Each movement risks exposure. Each exposed asset becomes a data point feeding Ukraine's targeting network. NATO observers note that this compresses Russia's operational depth, turning what were once rear areas into contested zones. Under these conditions, tempo collapses. Western military economists have emphasized another dimension: cost asymmetry. A single FPV drone, often priced in the low thousands of dollars, can destroy an armored vehicle worth millions. Multiply that imbalance across hundreds of thousands of engagements, and the economic logic becomes brutal. Russia is spending vastly more to replace losses than Ukraine is spending to inflict them. This inversion has caught Moscow in a cycle where increased expenditure produces diminishing returns. The monthly rhythm of losses reinforces the picture. Ukrainian officials disclosed that in late 2024 and early 2025, Russian casualties linked directly to drone strikes rose sharply from roughly 26,000 in October to over 30,000 in November, and even higher by December. Western intelligence estimates broadly align with these figures, suggesting Russia may be losing manpower faster than it can sustainably replenish it, even with aggressive recruitment and coercive mobilization. For NATO and the United States, this data has forced uncomfortable reassessments. Traditional planning assumptions about how many platforms are needed, how long wars can be sustained, and how attrition unfolds are being rewritten in real time. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. defense debates increasingly focus on whether future conflicts will be decided less by fleets and brigades and more by production capacity, software adaptation, and rapid learning cycles. Yet numbers alone do not explain how Ukraine maintains accuracy at this scale. Verification matters. False claims collapse credibility, and inflated statistics distort strategy. Ukraine addressed this by ensuring that most drone strikes are recorded, cataloged, and reviewed. Footage is not merely propaganda, it is evidence, training material, and operational feedback rolled into one. This obsession with verification is what gives the 80% figure its weight. It reflects not just confidence, but control over information, tempo, and narrative. And as the data accumulates, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. Russia is not losing sporadically. It is being ground down systematically. Yet the real engine behind this relentless efficiency lies deeper inside a system that turned battlefield survival into competition incentives and measurable performance. How do you motivate thousands of soldiers to fight smarter, adapt faster, and report truthfully in the chaos of modern war? Ukraine's answer shocked even seasoned Western analysts because it borrowed a concept more familiar to Silicon Valley than the battlefield. When Kyiv quietly introduced a performance-based, data-driven reward system for drone units, it did more than improve efficiency. It rewired how war itself was fought. Could turning combat into a measurable competition actually tilt the balance of power? At the core of this system was verification. Every confirmed strike captured on drone footage became both proof and currency. Ukrainian drone operators did not merely destroy targets, they documented them. Each verified hit earned points, and those points could be exchanged for tangible battlefield advantages, new drones, better optics, electronic warfare tools, and upgraded equipment. In effect, success generated resources, and resources enabled further success. Western outlets, such as The Guardian and Reuters, described the system as radical but ruthlessly practical. By late 2024, hundreds of Ukrainian drone units were participating, a sharp increase from just months earlier. The rapid expansion revealed something deeper than novelty. The system worked. Units that adapted faster rose on leaderboards. Those that shared tactics gained collective advantage. Inefficiency was no longer hidden behind vague reports, it was visible. For Ukraine's leadership, the benefits extended beyond morale. False reporting, long a problem in large-scale warfare, became harder to sustain. Claims without footage carried little weight. Inflated numbers lost value. Instead, commanders received granular, time-stamped data, showing what had been destroyed, where and how. This fed directly into operational planning, allowing Ukrainian forces to refine targeting priorities and identify which tactics produced the highest return. Military analysts in NATO circles noted how closely this resembled modern corporate performance systems. Clear metrics, transparent incentives, and rapid feedback loops replaced rigid hierarchy. Under President Donald Trump's administration, U.S. defense commentators increasingly referenced Ukraine's approach as a case study in adaptive warfare, where decentralized units outperformed larger forces through information superiority rather than sheer mass. The psychological impact on the battlefield was equally significant. For Ukrainian operators, the system offered agency in a war defined by exhaustion. Success was visible. Progress was measurable. For Russian troops, the opposite effect emerged. Every loss was filmed. Every mistake could echo across social media and intelligence channels. The sense of being watched constantly, relentlessly, eroded morale and amplified fear. Critics in the West raised ethical questions, warning about the gamification of killing. Ukrainian officials responded bluntly: the war already existed, and survival required innovation. In their view, the system reduced waste, increased accountability, and saved Ukrainian lives by accelerating outcomes. From a strategic standpoint, it also compressed Russia's margin for error. Slower adaptation now meant higher losses not over months, but within days. Importantly, the reward system did not operate in isolation. It meshed seamlessly with Ukraine's expanding drone industry and training pipelines. New operators learned from recorded successes. Tactics evolved weekly. What failed was discarded quickly. What worked spread fast. This learning velocity became one of Ukraine's greatest asymmetric advantages. Western defense experts have highlighted that this model challenges traditional NATO procurement cycles, which often measure innovation in years rather than weeks. Ukraine demonstrated that in high-intensity conflict, adaptability itself becomes a weapon. What followed next shocked analysts even more. This human-machine feedback loop did not just change combat effectiveness, it began reshaping the economics of the war itself. What happens when a war stops being decided by territory and starts being decided by spreadsheets? By late 2024, analysts began to notice a pattern that went beyond battlefield maps. Ukraine's drone campaign was no longer just killing Russian soldiers and destroying equipment. It was forcing Moscow into a financial and logistical spiral that few modern armies are designed to survive. If attrition becomes too expensive to sustain, does strategy even matter anymore? Every FPV drone strike carried an economic message. Ukraine was spending thousands of dollars to eliminate assets worth hundreds of thousands or millions. Russian artillery systems, once the backbone of Moscow's firepower, were increasingly pushed farther from the front to avoid drone detection. The result was not safety, but inefficiency. Longer ranges, reduced accuracy, increased ammunition consumption, and forced Russia to rely on specialized long-range shells that cost significantly more to produce. Reports from Defense News and Military Watch magazine in early 2025 highlighted a telling shift in Russian procurement priorities. Moscow began ordering vast quantities of extended-range artillery rounds, not to gain advantage, but simply to remain relevant. Each upgraded shell cost hundreds of dollars more than standard ammunition. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of rounds, the financial burden became staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent to compensate for drone-induced vulnerability. Manpower losses compounded the problem. Western intelligence estimates cited by Reuters suggested that Russian monthly fatalities were reaching levels that exceeded sustainable replacement rates. While official figures varied, NATO officials warned that even conservative estimates placed Russian losses at tens of thousands per month. Under these conditions, recruitment campaigns, financial incentives, and coercive mobilization could not keep pace. From a NATO perspective, this dynamic offered a sobering lesson. Russia was not collapsing due to a single catastrophic defeat, but from cumulative pressure applied relentlessly and cheaply. U.S. analysts under President Donald Trump's administration increasingly described Ukraine's strategy as economic warfare by other means. Instead of targeting cities or industries directly, drones targeted the cost structure of Russia's military machine. The human cost was equally destabilizing. Medical evacuation failures delayed recovery of wounded soldiers, and the constant threat of drone attack altered casualty ratios. Western observers noted that Russia's killed-to-wounded ratio appeared abnormally high, a sign that wounded soldiers were not being recovered in time, often because evacuation vehicles themselves became targets. This attritional reality forced difficult choices in Moscow. Protect artillery or protect logistics. Reinforce front lines or rotate exhausted units. Each decision carried trade-offs, and drones ensured that every compromise was punished. The battlefield became a place where hesitation translated directly into losses. Strategically, this erosion mattered more than territory gained or lost. Even modest Ukrainian defensive success imposed outsized costs on Russia. Analysts at the Atlantic Council argued that such dynamics could lock Russia into a war of diminishing returns, where each additional month delivered less progress at exponentially higher cost. Yet even as Russia struggled to absorb these losses, another transformation was unfolding, one that would redefine drones not just as weapons of attack, but as the cornerstone of Ukraine's air defense itself. Can the same technology that devastates an enemy also shield a nation from collapse? By early 2025, Ukraine's answer was becoming unmistakably clear. Drones were no longer just instruments of offense. They were evolving into the backbone of a new defensive architecture, one designed to counter Russia's relentless aerial campaign. As Moscow intensified its long-range strikes, the battlefield extended upward, and Ukraine followed. Throughout 2024, Russia increasingly relied on waves of Iranian-designed Shahed-type drones to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. These attacks targeted energy infrastructure, industrial facilities, and residential areas, especially during winter months, when damage carried maximum strategic impact. According to analyses cited by Reuters and the BBC, some attack waves reached into the hundreds of drones, often launched alongside cruise and ballistic missiles, to saturate defenses. The goal was clear exhaust interceptors, drain resources, and erode civilian morale. Ukraine responded with an unexpected pivot. Instead of relying solely on expensive surface-to-air missiles, it began deploying interceptor drones, small, fast, and purpose-built, to hunt other drones. These systems, operating at a fraction of the cost of traditional interceptors, could be launched rapidly and guided using the same real-time networks that powered Ukraine's offensive drone campaign. What mattered was not perfection, but volume and speed. Defense analysts in Western Europe described the concept as an anti-drone dome, combining mobile air defense teams, electronic warfare units, and interceptor drones into a layered system. The objective was preemption, destroy incoming threats before they reached critical infrastructure. Ukrainian officials emphasized that the system was designed to engage drones during approach, not after impact, a subtle but crucial distinction. From a NATO standpoint, this approach carried significant implications. Under President Donald Trump's administration, U.S. defense discussions increasingly focused on homeland and forward-based protection against low-cost aerial threats. Ukraine's experience suggested that missile-heavy defenses alone were economically unsustainable against mass drone attacks. Interceptor drones offered a scalable alternative, one that NATO planners began studying closely. The psychological effect on Russia was immediate. Shahed drones, once considered expendable terror weapons, now faced interception by equally expendable hunters. Each failed strike represented wasted resources, disrupted planning, and diminished propaganda value. Meanwhile, Ukraine's population saw visible evidence of adaptation, proof that the state was not merely enduring attacks, but learning from them. Crucially, this defensive evolution reinforced Ukraine's offensive momentum. Interceptor drones were often counted within the same production pipelines and training programs, ensuring that growth in one area fueled resilience in the other. The battlefield became a closed loop. Drones destroyed Russian assets, protected Ukrainian infrastructure, and preserved the industrial capacity needed to produce even more drones. Western experts cautioned that Russia would adapt, in turn possibly increasing drone numbers or introducing countermeasures. Yet the fundamental asymmetry remained. Ukraine's approach emphasized flexibility, learning speed, and cost efficiency traits that centralized systems struggle to match under pressure. What followed next unsettled even optimistic analysts as defense and offense merged into a single system. Ukraine began preparing for a scale of drone warfare that would dwarf anything seen before. What happens when a war of adaptation turns into a war of scale? As 2026 approaches, Ukraine's drone campaign is no longer defined solely by ingenuity or efficiency, but by ambition measured in millions. The question confronting military planners is no longer whether drones shape the battlefield, but how far their dominance can extend, and whether Russia or any conventional force can endure what comes next. By late 2025, multiple Western outlets, including Reuters and Defense News, reported that Ukraine's domestic drone production had expanded at a pace rarely seen in wartime industry. Estimates varied, but all pointed in the same direction. Output was doubling year over year. Even conservative figures suggested millions of drones either produced or planned annually. For Kyiv, this was not excess, it was necessity. Attrition at scale required replacement at scale. This production surge carried strategic meaning far beyond Ukraine. NATO analysts quietly acknowledged that Kyiv had become a real-time laboratory for future warfare. Under President Donald Trump's administration, U.S. defense circles increasingly debated whether industrial capacity, rather than platform sophistication, would decide conflicts against peer adversaries. Ukraine's model suggested that resilience now depended on how quickly a state could build, lose, and rebuild systems without breaking morale or finances. For Russia, the implications were stark. If Ukraine could sustain or increase its current tempo, Russian forces would face a battlefield where exposure anywhere near the front carried near certain risk. Analysts warned that even rear logistics hubs once considered relatively safe would remain under constant threat. The concept of a stable rear area was dissolving. At the same time, Ukraine's leadership signaled that drones would not replace soldiers, but would continue to reduce the burden placed on them. Precision surveillance and automation were framed as ways to conserve manpower while accelerating pressure. Western experts noted that this approach aligned with broader NATO concerns about demographic constraints and long-term force sustainability. Yet uncertainty remained. Russia would adapt. Countermeasures would emerge. Electronic warfare would intensify. But adaptation now favored the side that learned faster, not the one that possessed more legacy equipment. And on that axis, Ukraine had seized a durable advantage. What comes next may determine not just the outcome of this war, but the shape of every major conflict that